Welcome to the Healthcare Unfiltered Express, where I conduct short video interviews packed with relevant and timely information that you cannot miss. So sit back and enjoy the show. It's not his first time, but it's his first time on Healthcare Unfiltered Express. So, Marc, welcome to the show. Welcome to the Express version of Healthcare Unfiltered.
Thank you for having me back, Charlie. Good to be here.
And congrats on a very nice editorial and commentary in the JCO on specifically focused on CLL and the Bruin CLL trial that looked at pertubinib. Oh, there you go. I can't even talk anymore. But let's. So I've asked you to come on the show to talk about the trial and your commentary. They're
Sure.
very relevant and very recent.
Sure.
Tell us first on the trial that you provided a commentary on in JCO.
Yeah, so myself and Michael Williams from UVA were fortunate to have this opportunity to just comment on the Bruin CLL 313, which was a phase 3 randomized study of treatment-naive patients with CLL or SLL, and they were randomized to either pirtobrutinib, which is your non-covalent BTK inhibitor, versus 6 cycles of bendamustine plus rituximab. And the pirtobrutinib arm got treated until progression. So there were some differences in duration of treatment. And the primary endpoint of the study was investigator independent review committee assessed progression-free survival. And they also looked at overall survival as a secondary endpoint. But essentially, it was a positive study, which is somewhat not surprising. But because we're using less chemotherapy based on a wealth of accumulated evidence. But still, it was interesting to see the data for first-line pirtobrutinib showing a PFS benefit compared to chemo immunotherapy.
Marc, there was no overall survival benefit?
There was a trend towards overall survival in the interim analysis. The median follow-up was 32 months, and there was a small trend towards it, but the differences were not very, very wide between the curves. But the investigators felt that the data needed more time to mature to actually see substantial differences in OS. But the PFS was significantly improved.
Because, as you and I know, the other BTKI inhibitors have demonstrated survival benefit compared to chemotherapy, like
Sure.
you just mentioned earlier. So was that surprising results for you, or do you think there's some differences in the design of the study not to show an OS?
Well, I think we both love getting into the weeds about studies and critiquing them. There was crossover allowed in the benda-rituximab arm to go into the pirtobrutinib arm, and that might have decreased the differences in survival because what you get next is going to ultimately affect the survival. And we know in CLL, in a chronic leukemia, it takes many years to read out survival as well. So, but I don't think it was very surprising to see that a non-covalent BTK inhibitor was very effective in first line. I mean, we've already been using single agent covalent BTK inhibitors up front with a lot of success. And those studies have compared to all sorts of different control arms like chemoimmunotherapy. So I think this just positions pirtobrutinib, which is the first non-covalent BTK inhibitor for CLL, in the upfront setting with data to support it here. But of course, there are other ways you could design this trial, right? You could compare pirtobrutinib to a covalent BTK inhibitor for treatment-naive CLL.
Okay, great. So take us through your commentary. I mean, when you are asked to provide a commentary for, a large study like this, tell us about that and what are the points that you wanted to bring forward to readers?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's this series called Bridging the Gap that JCO has recently started, and it's an opportunity to both weigh in on the study, but also give like a case scenario. So we presented a case of a treatment-naive patient and what the thought process would be to decide which of the handful of options you have for first-line therapy for CLL that you're going to select from. So, we know that some of the considerations are the duration of treatment, time to find therapy versus indefinite therapy. And, many of the BTK upfront studies have been done with indefinite, therapy until progression, as was the CLL Bruin 313. And then there there's accumulating data for time-defined therapy, including using MRD status to define duration of therapy. So, the most common regimens we that are used in practice now are either a BTK inhibitor with or without an antibody, or venetoclax with a monoclonal antibody against CD20. And so, the main differences between those regimens to date have been that the venetoclax combination is time defined, whereas the BTK inhibitors are given until progression. But now we have accumulating evidence, for example, from the Amplify study, where you can give combinations of like a BTK and a venetoclax and give that for a time-defined period too, with very impressive outcomes. So the treatment landscape is expanding very quickly among the options. And what we wanted to get across in this editorial was basically that we're going to have more options for which BTK inhibitor is best used up front. And there still remains a lot of things undetermined. For example, what does the mutation profile look like in someone who's progressed on a non-covalent BTK inhibitor like pirtobrutinib up front? Because one of the benefits of pirtobrutinib is that it can overcome one of the most common mutations against BTK, which is the C481S. That is an amino acid in the ATP binding site of the BTK protein that the covalent BTK inhibitors like your acalabrutinib and zanubrutinib bind to. And the cell mutates that in order to be resistant to the covalent BTK inhibitors. So pirtobrutinib has the advantage of binding to a separate part of that ATP binding pocket and overcoming resistance. But we don't know what resistance looks like to pirtobrutinib if you get that up front, whether you can now sequence with a covalent BTK inhibitor. So those are some of the uncertainties that remain to be determined.
In your commentary, did you evaluate the classic risk stratification of CLL, the 17p deletion, TP53, and so on, and how this may have impacted the results?
Yeah, that's a great question because what's really interesting about the time we're in now is a lot of the therapies we have for CLL up front are agnostic to many of these mutations, which is great for patients. But I think the 17p or p53 mutant population still remains a high risk population that tends to have shorter survival, and those patients were excluded from this study. So that is an area of unmet need that needs to be explored further. However, some of the historically high-risk patients, like your unmutated IGVH, those patients did have a benefit with pirtobrutinib compared to bendamustine Rituxan in the 313 study. So we don't know so much about the outcomes of the higher risk 17p deletion patients, but I would imagine they still do fairly better with pirtobrutinib than chemoimmunotherapy.
I mean, I'm pretty sure that one of the biggest criticisms for the trial, as I'm certain you've heard, is that, I mean, it's great. It's comparing Pirto to an inferior control arm because we hope that in the United States, at least, no one is using BR as frontline therapy. I'm sure there are exceptions. How did you address that in your commentary?
No, I think we said that outright, that ideally, you want a comparator that is either similar in mechanism or similar in duration of therapy. And I think that there's enough evidence to date that we know that our targeted agents, like our BTK inhibitors or BCL2 inhibitors, either alone or in combination, are better than traditional chemotherapy. And I agree with you that I think chemotherapy is mostly done for CLL, outside of maybe some exceptions. But uh, I think that ideally you want to have control arms that have similar modern activity against some of these modern targets. And so I think we addressed it head on, saying that, this is not exactly an apples to apples comparison. And I think there are ongoing studies that are looking at upfront combinations with, venetoclax plus like acalabrutinib versus obinutuzumab plus venetoclax. So there are upfront studies comparing more apple to apple comparisons. But I think at least this study builds on historical studies that have used chemotherapy as a control arm to say that pirtobrutinib is at minimum very safe in this study and at best superior to chemotherapy, immunotherapy upfront for CLL. But again, they didn't compare it to one of the modern agents like a BCL2 or BTK inhibitor.
Is this being used to get, I don't think Pirto is yet approved in frontline CLL. Is this study being used to grant the FDA approval for frontline?
Right. Yes, this study actually came out about the same time as the Bruin 314, which included both treatment naive and relapse refractory CLL and looked at pirtobrutinib versus ibrutinib, actually. And about 40% of the patients in that study were treatment naive. The study's primary endpoint was non-inferiority for overall response, and it was a positive study. But yes, I think that these studies are going to be used for regulatory review for upfront, at least for accelerated approval for upfront pirtobrutinib. But I think it will still leave us with unanswered questions about which one we choose given the many options.
So the 314 did compare Pirto to
Ibrutinib,
ibrutinib.
right?
I mean, one of the biggest problems with a lot of these studies, I mean, let's face it, at the time, probably this was a great idea, Pirto against ibrutinib, but
Right.
then things change. And
So quickly,
what
yeah.
are you going to do? I mean, I don't know if this is something that you wanted to bring forward in your commentary in JCO that, it's inherent that our advances don't match how slow clinical trials are.
No, and that could, in the future, that could be even making protocol changes to a clinical trial protocol as paradigms evolve. But
Yeah.
um, the 314, did show a better safety profile, which again is not that surprising of pirtobrutinib versus ibrutinib, because even the second generation covalent BTKs like Acala and zanubrutinib have been shown to have a better safety profile than ibrutinib. So no, I agree with you. I mean, I think as things evolve quickly with these different targeted therapies, some of these trials become kind of obsolete in a way, based on modern practice.
Anything else you want to share with viewers and listeners that I may have overlooked?
No, again, it's a great time to be in the field. I think it's good to have all these different options that we can tailor to individual patients' needs. And I'm looking forward to seeing the ongoing studies of pirtobrutinib up front with comparator arms that more closely mimic are the types of agents we use in practice nowadays.
Congrats on the paper, Dr. Marc Braunstein on Healthcare Unfiltered Express. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chad. It was a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Healthcare Unfiltered Express. Until next time, take care.